Hey friends, what's up? Today I have something really cool for you. Today we're going to make our own MD-Svex. So you might have used MD-Svex in the past, so this is really an awesome preprocessor for Svelte. You can use this to use Svelte components inside Markdown and vice versa. And if you're interested in just using MD-Svex, I have an entire video on making a Markdown blog with SvelteKit and MD-Svex. But today we're not only going to learn how this works under the hood, because we're going to recreate a bit of a mini MD-Svex, right? We're actually going to learn a lot about how Svelte works and etc. And I think that this is the ultimate Markdown experience that I want, because I want absolute control over it. So let me show you here in our examples. You can see this is just a regular Markdown blog. Here I'm using a counter component in Svelte, nothing special. Here I have this widget, which we can look. Here I have this Markdown text. I can change this, so you can have interactive examples in your post to make them more interesting, right? Let me just change this color orange red. Let me actually show you something interesting. So in this case, maybe you would want to use an iframe or something, because here we're using this. If we remove title and we press title, we're going to target the elements on the page. And this is also kind of like really interesting. Maybe we can make like one of those blog CMSs with live editing and etc. I don't know. This is very interesting in my opinion. But yeah, you can also target, let's say, for example, we can target the p tags on the side, and you can see this looks like a complete disaster, right? So maybe we can revert these to titles just so this is affected. As you can see here, we're using a modern syntax highlighter, Shiki, which is really awesome. And I also have an entire video on using Shiki and why it's really awesome. But as you can see, this is a perfect example using this Svelte code snippet, why Shiki is so much better than your standard syntax highlighter, because we have something like this, which is a Svelte syntax. We don't really need to specify the syntax. It works absolutely beautifully, and the syntax highlighting is simple. You're going to be surprised how simple it is to implement something like this. And yeah, that's basically it. In the next part, I actually want to show you how a preprocessor actually works. So what is our goal and etc. How are we going to achieve this, right? Just to understand what a preprocessor is, even though I have also an entire video on preprocessors in Svelte and why they're so powerful. Alright, so if you look at our Markdown, here is nothing special. This is just a regular Markdown file, which is our post, and this gets actually treated as a Svelte component. I'm going to show you how that works. So here we have this Frontmatter, nothing special, but as you can see now we can use our script tag, because this is actually just treated as a Svelte component. So we can import our components here. Here I have a counter and widget, and if we look at them, we're going to see nothing special. I can also show you the widget, so we can open the widget. And if you're wondering how I made this widget, it's really just a cheat for a simple editor. I just stacked a pre and text area on top of each other, so I get this awesome syntax highlighting using Shiki again here. Very meta, right? But actually I want to show you how this actually works. So what is our goal, so you better understand the power of a preprocessor in Svelte. Alright, so if I open a new pane here on the right, let me just copy over everything. I'm going to create a new file, and I also even kind of don't want to even include syntax highlighting, because I kind of want you to understand that this is just a string, and whatever string is here, we're going to feed to the Svelte compiler. And before we do that, this is where a preprocessor comes in, because we can actually write a preprocessor that can turn this string into anything we want. So any valid Svelte component syntax is going to be valid at the end. And actually, let me show you what I mean by this. So actually I can copy the same code. Again, this is a new file. Let me just use the pointing point. I'm going to change the language mode back to Svelte or whatever. So actually our goal is going to be here to turn what we have on the left to an actually valid Svelte component. So for example, here we have this Frontmatter. What we're actually going to do is we're going to use something like gray matter to parse this thing, and then we're going to have an object, and then we can use context module. So we can say, for example, I think it's context module or module context. It's really not important. And then from here, we can actually say something like export meta, and then we can export an object with all of our data, right? And also imagine what possibilities this unlocks. Like, this isn't just for Markdown, etc. You can make useful preprocessors for anything you want. For example, let's say that maybe you want a table of contents on your page. You can just export a table of contents, right? And now, boom, you're going to have this actually on your page, not just inside of your Markdown where you have no control over it, right? You can actually have a table of contents. You can do whatever you want. And then the rest of this is also going to be very easy. So we're going to just turn Markdown to HTML, and we're going to use a Markdown preprocessor, right? So everything here that's not Markdown is going to be ignored anyhow. So these components, for example, is just going to be turned into a H2, right? So this is going to, at the end of the day, turn into something like this. And this is how simple this is. This, of course, is going to be a p tag. And this is basically what we're going to do using a preprocessor. That is how simple it is. So anything that we can turn at the end of the day into a valid Svelte component is what you can do using a Svelte preprocessor. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know what context module is, which I don't blame you for, this is something that it's kind of rarely used, to be honest. If you have a prop drilling problem, you should probably use the context API. But in this case, it actually works great because we want to export something on the module. But what the heck is actually a module? Let me just explain this quickly. So for example, let's say that you're writing here something like function, counter, and etc. So this file where you're writing your JavaScript and etc. is a module, right? And under the hood, this is how actually components work, because in Svelte 5 and moving forwards, components are just functions, right? But for example, let's say that you have multiple instances of a component and you want to share some state across them. Well, actually, instead of defining it inside, we can define it inside context module. So as I showed you before, we can just say const meta, and whatever we put inside of here is going to be available in each of these counter instances. And that's how simple that is. So now we can take that, we can just parse out the front matter. So actually in the next session, I'm going to show you how I have this project set up, because I'm not going to do everything from scratch. But if you want to dive deeper into it, I'm going to have a link in the description. Alright, so here I have a simple Svelte project. I'm importing this Markdown Preprocessor from source lib Markdown. This is where we're going to spend most of our time, because we're just going to focus on making the Markdown Preprocessor, right? And we have to specify the .js extension, because we don't have really any pre-processing here from Vite, because this is outside the scope of the sveltekit project. But you can publish this as a library maybe somewhere else, and then you can use all your tooling and etc. whatever you want, if you prefer to use TypeScript and etc. And the only important thing here is using extensions, right? So you can specify extensions .svelte and .md, but this can actually be .banana if you want, and this is going to work. And maybe you can also associate this .banana file with something else, but you can actually specify anything you want. And here what you specify is going to be treated as a Svelte file. If you want to learn more, you can watch my entire video on Svelte preprocessors. And here is the actually also important part. Here we're going to pass this preprocessor, and it has to come before anything else. So we want to turn this string into something else that we can pass to the Svelte compiler. And this is also going to get changed by the Vite preprocessor, right? If you're using Sass, TypeScript, and etc. So you want all of this to be done before it gets passed to the Vite preprocess. And here, another important thing I have here, since I have in the root here post, so this is how I want this to work. I want to have an example here, and I just want to have posts inside of here and components, right? And that's how I want my Markdown structure to work. So I'm going to just dump posts here, and I want to include any component that I might want. Another thing that you have to do if you're going to have this post folder at the root, in your Vite config, you have to actually specify this option server file system allow. So this is going to go one step up to serve files, right? Otherwise, you're going to run into some weird Vite error, right? But that's how we can do it. And for the actual project, there really isn't anything else that you should do. This is just really under routes. I have this post route. Here I have this page.svelte and page.ts where you're going to get the data. So here, if I open page.ts, as you can see, because we specified .md to be treated as a Svelte file, now we can import it here as a module. And you can see this is how this works. So we can get the content from the module, and we can also export the metadata, right? And this can also be table of contents, etc., whatever else you want. As you can see, if we go to plus page.svelte, we can just get the data from the props and we can output it on the page. And this is how easy peasy lemon squeezy this is, friends. But in our case, we're just going to mostly work inside lib/sveltedown.js, and you can actually see how simple this is. This isn't actually any amount of lines of code. It barely has any lines of code, right? You're going to actually see how simple this is to create something like this. Alright, so let's start working on the Markdown preprocessor, and here I'm going to save us a bunch of time from installing all of these dependencies, so you can do that yourself if you're following along. But basically, we're going to use Unified, which is just a toolchain for working with text. So we can convert Markdown to HTML, HTML to Markdown, and etc. There's other formats, but you probably heard of this and their plugin ecosystem, which are Remark and Rehype plugins. So for example, here I have this Remark GitHub flavored Markdown, so we have tables and a bunch of other things. And then I have Remark Smartypants. So Remark Smartypants is going to use actual typographic quotes instead of those fake quotes that you use in your post, right? And then we have something like Rehype Shiki, which is going to be used for the syntax highlighting. And then I'm going to use Gray Matter for Parsing Frontmatter, so we can return back the content and the metadata. Alright, so the first thing you have to do is actually declare our preprocessor. I'm going to name this Sveltedown, but you can name this whatever you want, right? And let's just say export default Sveltedown. This is actually going to be it. There we go. And now we also have to return now some methods. So we can actually change the script section, the content section, which is going to be the markup, and the style text section. But in our case, we just want to change the content. And again, if this is going too fast or is confusing to you, watch my entire video on how preprocessor in Svelte works. So this is going to be an async function, markup, and now we can destructure two things. We can destructure content and file name. And that's it. And now we can say, for example, console log content, and you're going to see this is going to log everything. So let's start the development server, and you're going to see it's going to spit out everything that it opens. So let me just refresh this. And you're going to see it's all of the components it interacts with once it boots up. But this is the reason why we actually picked that .md file, but it can be whatever you want. It can be .banana and etc. So to only console log content if file name ends with .md in our case. And let me just console log out. And again, the only thing that sucks here is hey, we have to restart the development server when we're updating this file here. But you're going to see now we only get the input for our Markdown component because we're only targeting .md files. And another thing here that sucks is this vague error message. So for example, could not find example. And it's really annoying because where is this error here in our terminal, right? So how can we know this? And basically this is a skill issue because that's a me problem. So for example, here in plus page.ts, I actually have this error here, could not find post, but we actually should output something more useful. So let's say, for example, in this case, let's output the actual error. And you're going to see now when we refresh this, let me just see, now we should get this error. So this is more verbose. And when we read this error here, it says post example blah blah. A component can have a single top level script element and a single top level script context module element. Okay, so this might sound confusing, but actually if you just go back to our post and if you just strip things down one at a time, you're actually going to find what this error is. In this example, the problem is we have this call block, we're using this script, but this actually closes the script tag, right? So Svelte is really confused, and we also have this problem, because these curly boys are going to be interpreted by Svelte as an expression, right? So let me actually prove this to you. For example, if I remove this call block, everything should work. Of course, it looks like junk, but actually we're not going to get any error. So you're going to see everything works as expected, kind of, right? But for now, I can just return this. And when we get to processing the Markdown, we're going to uncomment this. But for right now, let's just comment this block. And that's basically it. So now we're going to see if you refresh, everything is going to work as expected. Now we get more useful errors. Okay, so let's start with the low-hanging fruit, which is going to be Frontmatter. So I'm going to go back here to our code, and I'm going to create here a Frontmatter function. So we're going to process Frontmatter. It's going to take in content, and that's basically it. Alright, so now we can use matter, and we can actually destructure two things here. So we're going to pass content to matter, so we can get back two things, content and data, which we can return here. We can return content data, but the problem here is that we already have content here, so let's rename content to Markdown, and then let's just return that. Say Markdown here, and that's basically it. So here I'm going to yoink this, and now we can destructure from our Frontmatter two things. Again, we're going to pass the content, so now we're going to get back Markdown and data. So if I console log this out, console log Markdown data, let's just restart this, refresh the page. So now we're going to see that this is actually split in half. So we can see here we have our Markdown, which is this, right? So we can see this is our plain text, and here is the Frontmatter. So actually this is parsed for us. We don't have to do anything special. So now we have title, description, date, categories, publish, true, right? So this is from our Frontmatter. But to make this available here to our component, we actually have to return this on the module, same as MD_Svex does. So what you're going to do here, I'm actually going to create a meta variable. And let me just use template literals like this. And again, we just need to construct a valid Svelte component. This is absolutely awesome. So we can say script context module. And we just need to export the metadata, right? So we can say export const. We can say metadata. And now we need to serialize this because we can't just really pass data, right? This wouldn't work. So we actually have to say JSON stringify data. And instead of data, now we're just going to pass meta here. Alright, so now we're returning Markdown and meta. So now we split our Frontmatter and content, so we actually don't even have to worry about removing the Frontmatter, right? How beautiful is this, friends? And now actually, this will be so much easier with TypeScript, but we're moving blind here, friends. So we can just actually say meta, and let's just do this. Let's save everything, and again, since we made changes, we have to Control-C, kill it, and start it again. And let me just reload this, just so we get everything here. And now you can see, here we get our Markdown content, And here we get the meta. So this is just a string. And of course, everything in programming is a string, which is absolutely beautiful. But this is actually going to be a valid Svelte component. And now when we import this Markdown post as a module, we can actually destructure this from it. So let me actually show you that. To actually return the changed value, here is what we need to do. Let me remove this. We have to say return, and we have to return code, right? So we can, for example, say code content, but in our case, we actually want to return meta plus the code that we have. So for example, meta plus markdown. Let's just restart everything. Now when we go here and refresh, you're going to see now everything works because this is actually the front matter that we parsed. And again, if you're lost, let me just reiterate that. Here where we get the data for the page from the post, here we're importing this from the module, right? And then we can just plug those values. So for example, this can be content, metadata, it can be table of contents, it can be whatever you want. So now that we have this, we can send this to the component itself. So let's just go to the component itself in source routes/post, right? And now we get this from data. What do we get? We have meta. So we have data.meta, where is our metadata from the front matter, and we have data.content, which is our content itself, right? And how beautiful is this, friends? All right, so now we have the content, but we need to parse the markdown, right? And this is going to be very simple. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say async function. I'm going to name this parse markdown, which is going to accept content. And the only thing we have to do is create a markdown preprocessor or processor, right? Since we're using unified. So they're called processors. Yeah, so we can just say const processor, and now we can say unified. Actually, let's await it so we can invoke unified, and I'm going to go to a new line just so everything is neat and tidy. All right, so now we have to turn our markdown into an abstract syntax tree so we can parse it, right? So for this and using unified, we can just say use, and we can say to markdown AST. And then we can use the markdown plugins. So I'm going to say remark GitHub flavored markdown, and I'm also going to use SmartyPants, but you can include as many plugins as you want. All right, so now when we're done with Markdown, we need to turn this into an abstract HTML tree. So we can say .use to HTML AST, and we have to allow dangerous HTML because we're using things like script tag and etc., which otherwise would get parsed out or replaced with HTML entities. I'm not sure. All right, so now when we have this HTML tree, this is a perfect time to use our rehype plugins. So now we can just say rehype Shiki and boom. We can also pass it some option, for example, which theme I use. I always get as this, I use point address, and this just happens that this is a theme that ships with Shiki. If you have some more esoteric theme, you can of course load it. Alright, so now that we processed all of this, so now we have a tree, right? We just need to turn this into HTML string that we can render. So we can say use to HTML string. And again, we have to set allow dangerous HTML, and that's going to be it. And now once you're done, you just have to say .process. What do we want to process? We want to process the content. And because this returns a processor, we actually just want to return the result of this. To do that, we can just say return, and you can just say processor to string, and that's basically how simple that is. Awesome, so now here, where we have our markdown, we can just convert this or transform it from markdown to HTML. So you can say const HTML equals, we can say await. What we want to do, we want to parse the markdown. So we just pass the markdown, and that's how simple that is. And let me just console log it out so that you see that is true. So I'm going to restart everything, just restart the development server, refresh the page, and boom, now you're going to see all of the markdown is going to be transformed. You can see our component title went from markdown to HTML exactly as it should. But actually, you're going to notice that you're going to run into some problems. Because, for example, you can see how we're passing this counter component with this curly boys, which is perfectly fine. This is a regular Svelte component. But remember what I told you about expressions. This is where we're going to run into a problem. As you can see, for example, here where it's on click and it has this curly boy, Svelte is actually going to try to interpret that as an expression. So here, for example, we actually don't want to return code meta plus markdown. We want to return meta plus HTML. So when we save this, let me just refresh this, we're going to run into an error. As you can see, we get an internal error and you're like, okay, what is this? Count is not defined and etc. And then you just start looking at this massive error, right? Which might look confusing, but actually it makes perfect sense. Because for example, let's just go back to our blog post. Again, I'm going to remove all of this. As you can see, it works fine. Again, that pesky component, right? So what we have to do for the last part, we actually have to replace those characters with HTML entities. Alright, so going back to our code, beautiful. Alright, so now let's leave it as is, and now we can actually create a new function here. And I'm going to name this function escape HTML. This is going to accept the content, and we're going to return the escape content. And let me actually close the terminal, and for this part, actually stick with me because this might seem a bit weird, but there's a method to my madness. So for example, what I'm going to do, I'm actually first going to replace all of the entities in the file, then I'm going to specifically target the components with regex, and I'm going to return them back from HTML entities to the regular curly boys. And I'm doing that because we actually run into some weird issues and annoyances with how you convert that using regex, right? So it gets really complicated, but I actually found that this is the easiest way. And of course, you can do this your way. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to reassign content. I'm going to say content replace. So we're going to actually pass this regex here. We're going to use the opening curly boy. Let's just make it G for global or gangsta, whatever you want. Cool, and now we only have to replace it with this HTML entity, which is going to be ampersand, £123, and then colon. And let's also do the same thing for the closing curly boy. So we're going to say replace. It's going to be closing, and it's not 123, but it's 125. Okay, so now that we converted all of the text, we just want to revert the components. So for this, we're going to use a component regex. I'm going to say cons component regex, and this is really simple. So here we're going to create a regex. We're going to say it has to have this opening pointy boy. It has to start with a capital letter, so we can say A to Z, and then we can match everything after that. Of course, you can be more concise with this. You can target only the components that have the curly boys in them, but that's up to you. I haven't found a problem with this approach yet. And of course, let's add the global flag. Alright, so now we just need to find the components, loop over them, and replace them. So I'm going to say cons components, and then we have to say content match, and let's pass it the component regex. That's basically it. Alright, so let's say components, and they might not exist. So let's use question mark for each. So now we're going to loop over the components. And first we need to replace the value of the component, so we can replace the old value with the new value. So we can say const replaced. And we, in this case, need to do the opposite thing for the component, right? So Svelte treats it as a regular component. So we can say component replace. And here we're going to first start with the entity. So let's just copy this over so we don't make a mistake. And what we want to replace it with the opening curly boy. Alright, so now we can just copy this over because we want to do it again. But for the closing curly boy, so let's just close it. And instead of 123, it's 125. Alright, so we just need to return what we matched with the updated or replaced component, right? And that's how easy peasy lemon squeezy that is. Alright, so we can reassign content. We can say content replace. Replace the component with what? With the replaced one, right? And then once that is done, we can just say return content. And that's actually it. So now we can go here to our preprocessor. Below HTML, we can actually say const code. And we can just say escape HTML. We can pass in the HTML, and now instead of returning meta plus HTML, we can actually return code. Alright, let's save this. I'm going to restart the development server, and let me actually log this out just to see what's going on. Also log code. Let's do that, and now we're actually going to restart. And now, if you look at our component, everything looks right. Here we have the script. Again, we're just aiming to make a valid Svelte component, nothing special. As we can see here, this looks right. This is our regular component, so we did that right. And let's actually see when we look here, this should be replaced with our HTML entities, so we should find no curly boys here. So remember how it was complaining about count or something because it couldn't find it? Well, here it is, count, and again, it's not going to be interpreted as an expression by Svelte because we're actually replacing this with HTML entities. How beautiful is this, friends? Alright, so now when we go here, and even if I refresh it for good measure, you can see everything works beautifully. So now we can also change this and do whatever else you want, right? Alright, that's basically it. Regardless if you just want to make a blog with empty specs, or if you want to learn how to do it yourself and have complete control by making your own custom Markdown preprocessor, I hope you at least learned something. Alright, so if you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can also support me by becoming a patron. Thank you for watching, and catch you in the next one. Peace!